Tonight you are exactly where you need to be. You've found your way to a quiet little corner of the night, where the world slows down, the stars begin to whisper, and soft stories drift like moonlight through the dark. I'm so glad you're here. Before we begin tonight's story, I just want to gently ask, if you find comfort in these bedtime moments, it would mean the world if you'd take a second to like this video, subscribe, or even share it with someone else who could use a little peace. Your support helps keep this cozy space glowing night after night. Now settle in, let the day melt away, and let's begin. There lived once a king and queen who had an only daughter, a charming and beautiful girl, dearer to them than anything else in the world. When the princess was 12 years old, the queen fell sick, and nothing that could be done for her was of any use. All the doctors in the kingdom did their best to cure her, but in spite of their efforts, she grew worse and worse. As she was about to die, she sent for the king and said to him, "Promise me that whatever our daughter asks, you will do, no matter whether you wish to or not." The king at first hesitated, but as she added, "Unless you promise this, I cannot die in peace," he at length did as she desired, and gave the promise, after which she became quite happy and died. It happened that near the king's palace lived a noble lady, whose little girl was of about the same age as the princess, and the two children were always together. After the queen's death, the princess begged that this lady should come to live with her in the palace. The king was not quite pleased with this arrangement, for he distrusted the lady, but the princess wished so much for it that he did not like to refuse. "I am lonely, father," she said, "and all the beautiful presents you give me cannot make up to me for the loss of my mother. If this lady comes to live here, I shall almost feel as if the queen had come back to me." So a magnificent suite of rooms was prepared and set aside for the newcomers, and the little princess was wild with joy at the thought of having her friends so near her. The lady and her daughter arrived, and for a long time all went well. They were very kind to the motherless princess, and she almost began to forget how dull she had been before they came. Then, one day, as she and the other girl were playing together in the gardens of the palace, the lady came to them, dressed for a journey, and kissed the princess tenderly, saying, "Farewell, my child. My daughter and I must leave you and go far away." The poor princess began to cry bitterly. "Oh, you must not leave me," she sobbed. "What shall I do without you? Please, oh, please stay." The lady shook her head. "It almost breaks my heart to go, dear child," she said, "but alas, it must be." "Is there nothing that can keep you here?" asked the princess. "Only one thing," answered the lady, "and as that is impossible, we will not speak of it." "Nothing is impossible," persisted the princess. "Tell me what it is, and it shall be done." So at last her friend told her. "If the king, your father, would make me his queen, I would stay," she said, "but that he would never do." "Oh yes, that is easy enough," cried the princess, delighted to think that after all they need not be parted. And she ran off to find her father and beg him to marry the lady at once. He had done everything she asked, and she was quite certain he would do it. "What is it, my daughter?" he asked when he saw her. "You have been crying. Are you not happy?" "Father," she said, "I have come to ask you to marry the Countess," for that was the lady's real title. "If you do not, she will leave us, and then I shall be as lonely as before. You have never refused me what I have asked before. Do not refuse me now." The king turned quite pale when he heard this. He did not like the Countess, and so of course he did not wish to marry her. Besides, he still loved his dead wife. "No, that I cannot do, my child," he said at last. At these words the princess began to cry once more, and the tears ran down her cheeks so fast and she sobbed so bitterly that her father felt quite miserable too. He remembered the promise he had given always to do what his daughter asked him, and in the end he gave way and promised to marry the Countess. The princess at once was all smiles, and ran away to tell the good news. Soon after, the wedding was celebrated with great festivities, and the Countess became queen. But in spite of all the joy and merriment that filled the palace, the king looked pale and sad, for he was certain that ill would come of the marriage. Sure enough, in a very short time the queen's manner towards the princess began to change. She was jealous of her because she, instead of her own daughter, was heir to the throne, and very soon she could no longer hide her thoughts. Instead of speaking kindly and lovingly as before, her words became rough and cruel, and once or twice she even slapped the princess's face. The king was very unhappy at seeing his dearly loved daughter suffer, and at last she became so wretched that he could no longer bear it. Calling her to him one day, he said, "My daughter, you are no longer merry as you should be, and I fear that it is the fault of your stepmother. It will be better for you to live with her no longer. Therefore I have built you a castle on the island in the lake, and that is to be your home in future. There you can do just as you like, and your stepmother will never enter it." The princess was delighted to hear this, and still more pleased when she saw the castle, which was full of beautiful things, and had a great number of windows looking out on the lovely blue water. There was a boat in which she might row herself about, and a garden where she could walk whenever she wished without fear of meeting the unkind queen, and the king promised to visit her every day. For a long time she dwelt in peace, and grew more and more beautiful every day. Everyone who saw her said, "The princess is the loveliest lady in the land." And this was told to the queen, who hated her stepdaughter still more because her own daughter was ugly and stupid. One day it was announced that a great meeting of knights and nobles was to be held in a neighboring kingdom, distant about 2 days' journey. There were to be all kinds of festivities, and a tournament was to be fought, and a banquet held, in honor of the coming of age of the prince of the country. The princess's father was amongst those invited, but before he set out he went to take leave of his daughter. Although she had such a beautiful home and was no longer scolded by the queen, the poor princess was dreadfully lonely, and she told her father that it would be better if she were dead. He did his best to comfort her and promised that he would soon return. Was there anything he could do to help her? "Yes," she said, "you may greet the Green Knight from me." Now the king wondered a little at these words, for he had never heard of the Green Knight, but there was no time to ask questions. Therefore he gave the promise and rode off on his journey. When he came to the palace where the festivities were to take place, the first thing he did was to ask, "Can anyone tell me where I may find the Green Knight?" No, they were very sorry, but none had ever heard of such a person either. Certainly he was not to be found there. At this the king grew troubled, and not even the banquet or the tournament could make him feel happier. He inquired of everyone he saw, "Do you know the Green Knight?" But the only answer he got was, "No, your majesty, we have never heard of him." At length he began to believe that the princess was mistaken, and that there was no such person, and he started on his homeward journey sorrowfully enough, for this was the first time for many months that the princess had asked him to do anything for her, and he could not do it. He thought so much about it that he did not notice the direction his horse was taking, and presently he found himself in the midst of a dense forest where he had never been before. He rode on, looking for the path, but as the sun began to set he realized that he was lost. At last, to his delight, he saw a man driving some pigs, and riding up to him he said, "I have lost my way. Can you tell me where I am?" "You are in the Green Knight's forest," answered the man, "and these are his pigs." At that the king's heart grew light. "Where does the Green Knight live?" he asked. "It is a very long way from here," said the swineherd, "but I will show you the path." So he went a little farther with the king and put him on the right road, and the king bade him farewell. Presently he came to a second forest, and there he met another swineherd driving pigs. "Whose beasts are those, my man?" he asked. "They are the Green Knight's," said the man. "And where does he live?" inquired the king. "Oh, not far from here," was the reply. Then the king rode on, and about midday he reached a beautiful castle standing in the midst of the loveliest garden you can possibly imagine, where fountains played in marble basins, and peacocks walked on the smooth lawns. On the edge of a marble basin sat a young and handsome man who was dressed from head to foot in a suit of green armor, and was feeding the goldfish which swam in the clear water. "This must be the Green Knight," thought the king, and going up to the young man he said courteously, I have come, sir, to give you my daughter's greeting, but I have wandered far and lost my way in your forest." The knight looked at him for a moment as though puzzled. "I have never met either you or your daughter," he said at last, "but you are very welcome all the same." And he waved his hand towards the castle. However, the king took no notice and told him that his daughter had sent a message to the Green Knight, and as he was the only Green Knight in the kingdom, this message must be for him. "You must pass the night with me here," said the knight, and as the sun was already set, the king was thankful to accept the invitation. They sat down in the castle hall to a magnificent banquet, and although he had traveled much and visited many monarchs in their palaces, the king had never fared better than at the table of the Green Knight, whilst his host himself was so clever and agreeable that he was delighted, and thought what a charming son-in-law this knight would make. Next morning, when he was about to set forth on his journey home, the Green Knight put into his hand a jeweled casket, saying, "Will your Highness graciously condescend to carry this gift to the princess, your daughter? It contains my portrait, that when I come she may know me, for I feel certain that she is the lady I have seen night after night in a dream, and I must win her for my bride." The king gave the knight his blessing, and promised to take the gift to his daughter. With that he set off, and ere long reached his own country. The princess was awaiting him anxiously when he arrived, and ran to his arms in her joy at seeing her dear father again. "And did you see the Green Knight?" she asked. "Yes," answered the king, drawing out the casket the knight had sent, "and he begged me to give you this that you may know him when he arrives and not mistake him for somebody else." When the princess saw the portrait, she was delighted, and exclaimed, "It is indeed the man whom I have seen in my dreams. Now I shall be happy, for he and no other shall be my husband." Very soon after the Green Knight arrived, and he looked so handsome in his green armor, with a long green plume in his helmet, that the princess fell still more in love with him than before. And when he saw her, and recognized her as the lady whom he had so often dreamt of, he immediately asked her to be his bride. The princess looked down and smiled as she answered him. "We must keep the secret from my stepmother until the wedding day," said she, "for otherwise she will find a way to do us some evil." "As you please," replied the prince, "but I must visit you daily, for I can live no longer without you. I will come early in the morning and not leave until it is dark. Thus the queen will not see me row across the lake." For a long time the Green Knight visited the princess every day, and spent many hours wandering with her through the beautiful gardens where they knew the queen could not see them. But secrets, as you know, are dangerous things, and at last, one morning, a girl who was in service at the palace happened to be walking by the lake early in the morning and beheld a wonderfully handsome young man in a beautiful suit of green satin come down to the edge of the lake. Not guessing that he was watched, he got into a little boat that lay moored to the bank, rowed himself over to the island where the princess's castle stood. The girl went home wondering who the knight could be, and as she was brushing the queen's hair, she said to her, "Does your majesty know that the princess has a suitor?" "Nonsense," replied the queen crossly, but she was dreadfully vexed at the mere idea, as her own daughter was still unmarried, and was likely to remain so because she was so ill-tempered and stupid that no one wanted her. "It is true," persisted the girl. "He is dressed all in green and is very handsome. I saw him myself, though he did not see me, and he got into a boat and rowed over to the island, and the princess was waiting for him at the castle door." "I must find out what this means," thought the queen, but she bade her maid of honor cease chattering and mind her own business. Early next morning the queen got up and went down to the shore of the lake, where she hid herself behind a tree. Sure enough, there came a handsome knight dressed in green, just as the maid of honor had said, and he got into a boat and rowed over to the island where the princess awaited him. The angry queen remained by the lake all day, but it was not until the evening that the knight returned, and leaping on shore, he tied the boat to its moorings and went away through the forest. "I have caught my stepdaughter nicely," thought the queen, "but she shall not be married before my own sweet girl. I must find a way to put a stop to this." Accordingly, she took a poisoned nail and stuck it in the handle of the oar in such a way that the knight would be sure to scratch his hand when he picked up the oar. Then she went home laughing, very much pleased with her cleverness. The next day the Green Knight went to visit the princess as usual, but directly he took up the oars to row over to the island he felt a sharp scratch on his hand. "Oof!" he said, dropping the oars from pain. What can have scratched so? But look as he might, only a tiny mark was to be seen. "Well, it's strange how a nail could have come here since yesterday," he thought. "Still, it is not very serious, though it hurts a good deal." And indeed it seemed such a little thing that he did not mention it to the princess. However, when he reached home in the evening, he felt so ill he was obliged to go to bed, with no one to attend on him except his old nurse. But of this, of course, the princess knew nothing, and the poor girl, fearing lest some evil should have befallen him, or some other maiden more beautiful than she should have stolen his heart from her, grew almost sick with waiting. Lonely indeed she was, for her father, who would have helped her, was traveling in a foreign country, and she knew not how to obtain news of her lover. In this manner time passed away, and one day, as she sat by the open window crying and feeling very sad, a little bird came and perched on the branch of a tree that stood just underneath. It began to sing, and so beautifully that the princess was obliged to stop crying and listen to it, and very soon she found out that the bird was trying to attract her attention. "To wit, your lover is sick," it sang. "Alas," cried the princess, "what can I do? To wit, you must go to your father's palace." "And what shall I do there?" she asked. "To wit, there you will find a snake with 9 young ones." "Ugh!" answered the princess with a shiver, for she did not like snakes. But the little bird paid no heed. "Put them in a basket and go to the Green Knight's palace," said she. "And what am I to do with them when I get there?" she cried, blushing all over, though there was no one to see her but the bird. "Dress yourself as a kitchen maid and ask for a place. To wit, then you must make soup out of the snakes. Give it 3 times to the knight, and he will be cured. To wit." "But what has made him ill?" asked the princess. The bird, however, had flown away, and there was nothing for it but to go to her father's palace and look for the snakes. When she came there, she found the mother snake with the 9 little snakes all curled up so that you could hardly tell their heads from their tails. The princess did not like having to touch them, but when the old snake had wriggled out of the nest to bask a little in the sun, she picked up the young ones and put them in a basket as the bird had told her, and ran off to find the Green Knight's castle. All day she walked along, sometimes stopping to pick the wild berries or to gather a nosegay, but though she rested now and then, she would not lie down to sleep before she reached the castle. At last she came in sight of it, and just then she met a girl driving a flock of geese. "Good day," said the princess. "Can you tell me if this is the castle of the Green Knight?" "Yes, that it is," answered the goose girl, "for I am driving his geese. But the Green Knight is very ill, and they say that unless he can be cured within 3 days he will surely die." At this news the princess grew as white as death. The ground seemed to spin round, and she closed her hand tight on a bush that was standing beside her. By and by, with a great effort, she recovered herself and said to the goose girl, "Would you like to have a fine silk dress to wear?" The goose girl's eyes glistened. "Yes, that I would," answered she. "Then take off your dress and give it to me, and I will give you mine," said the Princess Dot. The girl could scarcely believe her ears, but the princess was already unfastening her beautiful silk dress and taking off her silk stockings and pretty red shoes, and the goose girl lost no time in slipping out of her rough linen skirt and tunic. Then the princess put on the other's rags and let down her hair and went to the kitchen to ask for a place. "Do you want a kitchen maid?" she said. "Yes, we do," answered the cook, who was too busy to ask the newcomer many questions. The following day, after a good night's rest, the princess set about her new duties. The other servants were speaking of their master, and saying to each other how ill he was, and that unless he could be cured within 3 days, he would surely die. The princess thought of the snakes and the bird's advice, and lifting her head from the pots and pans she was scouring, she said, "I know how to make a soup that has such a wonderful power that whoever tastes it is sure to be cured, whatever his illness may be. As the doctors cannot cure your master, shall I try?" At first they all laughed at her. "What? A scullion cure the knight when the best physicians in the kingdom have failed?" But at last, just because all the physicians had failed, they decided that it would do no harm to try, and she ran off joyfully to fetch her basket of snakes and make them into broth. When this was ready, she carried some to the knight's room and entered it boldly, pushing aside all the learned doctors who stood beside his bed. The poor knight was too ill to know her. Besides, she was so ragged and dirty that he would not have been likely to do so had he been well. But when he had taken the soup, he was so much better that he was able to sit up. The next day he had some more, and then he was able to dress himself. "That is certainly wonderful soup," said the cook. The third day, after he had eaten his soup, the knight was quite well again. "Who are you?" he asked the girl. "Was it you who made this soup that has cured me?" "Yes," answered the princess. "Choose then whatever you wish as a reward," said the knight, "and you shall have it." "I would be your bride," said the princess. The knight frowned in surprise at such boldness and shook his head. "That is the one thing I cannot grant," he said, "for I am pledged to marry the most beautiful princess in the world. Choose again." Then the princess ran away and washed herself and mended her rags, and when she returned, the Green Knight recognized her at once. You can think what a joyful meeting that was. Soon after, they were married with great splendor. All the knights and princes in the kingdom were summoned to the wedding, and the princess wore a dress that shone like the sun, so that no one had ever beheld a more gorgeous sight. The princess's father, of course, was present, but the wicked queen and her daughter were driven out of the country, and as nobody has seen them since, very likely they were eaten by wild beasts in the forest. But the bride and bridegroom were so happy that they forgot all about them, and they lived with the old king till he died, when they succeeded him. Once there lived a handsome young man named Ram Singh, who, though a favorite with everyone, was unhappy because he had a scold for a stepmother. All day long she went on talking, until the youth was driven so distracted that he determined to go away somewhere and seek his fortune. No sooner had he decided to leave his home than he made his plans, and the very next morning he started off with a few clothes in a wallet and a little money in his pocket. But there was one person in the village to whom he wished to say goodbye, and that was a wise old guru or teacher who had taught him much. So he turned his face first of all towards his master's hut, and before the sun was well up was knocking at his door. The old man received his pupil affectionately, but he was wise in reading faces and saw at once that the youth was in trouble. "My son," said he, "what is the matter?" "Nothing, father," replied the young man, "but I have determined to go into the world and seek my fortune." "Be advised," returned the guru, "and remain in your father's house. It is better to have half a loaf at home than to seek a whole one in distant countries." But Ram Singh was in no mood to heed such advice, and very soon the old man ceased to press him. "Well," said he at last, "if your mind is made up, I suppose you must have your way. But listen carefully, and remember 5 parting counsels which I will give you, and if you keep these, no evil shall befall you. First, always obey without question the orders of him whose service you enter. Second, Never speak harshly or unkindly to anyone. Third, never lie. Fourth, never try to appear the equal of those above you in station. And fifth, wherever you go, if you meet those who read or teach from the holy books, stay and listen, if but for a few minutes, that you may be strengthened in the path of duty. Then Ram Singh started out upon his journey, promising to bear in mind the old man's words. After some days he came to a great city. He had spent all the money which he had at starting, and therefore resolved to look for work however humble it might be. Catching sight of a prosperous-looking merchant standing in front of a shop full of grain of all kinds, Ram Singh went up to him and asked whether he could give him anything to do. The merchant gazed at him so long that the young man began to lose heart, but at length he answered, "Yes, of course, there is a place waiting for you." "What do you mean?" asked Ram Singh. "Why," replied the other, "yesterday our Raja's chief wazir dismissed his body servant and is wanting another. Now you are just the sort of person that he needs, for you are young and tall and handsome. I advise you to apply there." Thanking the merchant for this advice, the young man set out at once for the wazir's house, and soon managed, thanks to his good looks and appearance, to be engaged as the great man's servant. One day, soon after this, the Raja of the place started on a journey, and the chief wazir accompanied him. With them was an army of servants and attendants, soldiers, muleteers, camel drivers, merchants with grain and stores for man and beast, singers to make entertainment by the way, and musicians to accompany them, besides elephants, camels, horses, mules, ponies, donkeys, goats, and carts and wagons of every kind and description, so that it seemed more like a large town on the march than anything else. Thus they traveled for several days, till they entered a country that was like a sea of sand, where the swirling dust floated in clouds, and men and beasts were half choked by it. Towards the close of that day they came to a village, and when the headman hurried out to salute the Raja and to pay him their respects, they began, with very long and serious faces, to explain that, whilst they and all that they had were of course at the disposal of the Raja, the coming of so large a company had nevertheless put them into a dreadful difficulty, because they had never a well nor spring of water in their country, and they had no water to give drink to such an army of men and beasts. Great fear fell upon the host at the words of the headmen, but the Raja merely told the wazir that he must get water somehow, and that settled the matter so far as he was concerned. The wazir sent off in haste for all the oldest men in the place, and began to question them as to whether there were no wells nearby. They all looked helplessly at each other and said nothing, but at length one old greybeard replied, "Truly, Sir Wazir, there is, within a mile or two of this village, a well which some former king made hundreds of years ago. It is, they say, great and inexhaustible, covered in by heavy stonework, and with a flight of steps leading down to the water in the very bowels of the earth. But no man ever goes near it because it is haunted by evil spirits, and it is known that whoso disappears down the well shall never be seen again. The wazir stroked his beard and considered a moment. Then he turned to Ram Singh, who stood behind his chair. "There is a proverb," said he, "that no man can be trusted until he has been tried. Go you and get the Raja and his people water from this well." Then there flashed into Ram Singh's mind the first counsel of the old Guru. Always obey without question the orders of him whose service you enter. So he replied at once that he was ready and left to prepare for his adventure. 2 great brazen vessels he fastened to a mule. 2 lesser ones he bound upon his shoulders, and thus provided he set out, with the old villager for his guide. In a short time they came to a spot where some big trees towered above the barren country, whilst under their shadow lay the dome of an ancient building. This the guide pointed out as the well, but excused himself from going further as he was an old man and tired, and it was already nearly sunset, so that he must be returning home. So Ram Singh bade him farewell, and went on alone with the mule dot. Arrived at the trees, Ram Singh tied up his beast, lifted the vessels from his shoulder, and having found the opening of the well, descended by a flight of steps which led down into the darkness. The steps were broad white slabs of alabaster which gleamed in the shadows as he went lower and lower. All was very silent. Even the sound of his bare feet upon the pavements seemed to wake an echo in that lonely place, and when one of the vessels which he carried slipped and fell upon the steps, it clanged so loudly that he jumped at the noise. Still he went on, until at last he reached a wide pool of sweet water, and there he washed his jars with care before he filled them, and began to remount the steps with the lighter vessels, as the big ones were so heavy he could only take up one at a time. Suddenly something moved above him, and looking up he saw a great giant standing on the stairway. In one hand he held clasped to his heart a dreadful-looking mass of bones. In the other was a lamp which cast long shadows about the walls, and made him seem even more terrible than he really was. "What think you, O mortal," said the giant, "of my fair and lovely wife?" And he held the light towards the bones in his arms and looked lovingly at them. Now I must tell you that this poor giant had had a very beautiful wife, whom he had loved dearly. But when she died, her husband refused to believe in her death, and always carried her about long after she had become nothing but bones. Ram Singh, of course, did not know of this, but there came to his mind the second wise saying of the Guru, which forbade him to speak harshly or inconsiderately to others. So he replied, "Truly, sir, I am sure you could find nowhere such another." "Ah, what eyes you have!" cried the delighted giant. "You at least can see. I do not know how often I have slain those who insulted her by saying she was but dried bones. You are a fine young man, and I will help you." So saying, he laid down the bones with great tenderness, and snatching up the huge brass vessels, carried them up again, and replaced them with such ease that it was all done by the time that Ram Singh had reached the open air with the smaller ones. "Now," said the giant, You have pleased me, and you may ask of me one favor, and whatever you wish I will do it for you. Perhaps you would like me to show you where lies buried the treasure of dead kings, he added eagerly. But Ram Singh shook his head at the mention of buried wealth. The favor that I would ask, said he, is that you will leave off haunting this well so that men may go in and out and obtain water. Perhaps the giant expected some favor more difficult to grant, for his face brightened and he promised to depart at once. And as Ram Singh went off through the gathering darkness with his precious burden of water, he beheld the giant striding away with the bones of his dead wife in his arms. Great was the wonder and rejoicing in the camp when Ram Singh returned with the water. He never said anything, however, about his adventure with the giant, but merely told the Raja that there was nothing to prevent the well being used. And used it was, and nobody ever saw any more of the giant. The Raja was so pleased with the bearing of Ram Singh that he ordered the wazir to give the young man to him in exchange for one of his own servants. So Ram Singh became the Raja's attendant. And as the days went by, the king became more and more delighted with the youth, because mindful of the old Guru's third counsel, he was always honest and spoke the truth. He grew in favor rapidly until at last the Raja made him his treasurer, and thus he reached a high place in the court and had wealth and power in his hands. Unluckily, the Raja had a brother who was a very bad man, and this brother thought that if he could win the young treasurer over to himself, he might by this means manage to steal little by little any of the king's treasure which he needed. Then, with plenty of money, he could bribe the soldiers and some of the Raja's counselors, head a rebellion, dethrone and kill his brother, and reign himself instead. He was too wary, of course, to tell Ram Singh of all these wicked plans, but he began by flattering him whenever he saw him, and at last offered him his daughter in marriage. But Ram Singh remembered the fourth counsel of the old Guru, never to try to appear the equal of those above him in station. Therefore he respectfully declined the great honor of marrying a princess. Of course, the prince, baffled at the very beginning of his enterprise, was furious, and determined to work Ram Singh's ruin. And entering the Raja's presence, he told him a story about Ram Singh having spoken insulting words of his sovereign and of his daughter. What it was all about nobody knew, and as it was not true, the wicked prince did not know either. But the Raja grew very angry and red in the face as he listened, and declared that until the treasurer's head was cut off, neither he nor the princess nor his brother would eat or drink. But, added he, I do not wish anyone to know that this was done by my desire, and anyone who mentions the subject will be severely punished. And with this, the prince was forced to be content. Then the Raja sent for an officer of his guard and told him to take some soldiers and ride at once to a tower which was situated just outside the town. And if anyone should come to inquire when the building was going to be finished, or should ask any other questions about it, the officer must chop his head off and bring it to him. As for the body, that could be buried on the spot. The old officer thought these instructions rather odd, but it was no business of his, so he saluted and went off to do his master's bidding. Early in the morning the Rajah, who had not slept all night, sent for Ram Singh and bade him go to the new hunting tower and ask the people there how it was getting on and when it was going to be finished, and to hurry back with the answer. Away went Ram Singh upon his errand, but on the road, as he was passing a little temple on the outskirts of the city, he heard someone inside reading aloud, and remembering the Guru's 5th counsel, he just stepped inside and sat down to listen for a minute. He did not mean to stay longer, but became so deeply interested in the wisdom of the teacher that he sat and sat and sat while the sun rose higher and higher. In the meantime, the wicked prince, who dared not disobey the Rajah's command, was feeling very hungry. And as for the princess, she was quietly crying in a corner waiting for the news of Ram Singh's death, so that she might eat her breakfast. Hours passed, and stare as he might from the window, no messenger could be seen. At last the prince could bear it no longer, and hastily disguising himself so that no one should recognize him, he jumped on a horse and galloped out to the hunting tower, where the Rajah had told him that the execution was to take place. But when he got there was no execution going on. There were only some men engaged in building, and a number of soldiers idly watching them. He forgot that he had disguised himself and that no one would know him, so riding up he cried out, "Now then, you men, why are you idling about here instead of finishing what you came to do? When is it to be done?" At his words, the soldiers looked at the commanding officer, who was standing a little apart from the rest. Unperceived by the prince, he made a slight sign. A sword flashed in the sun, and off flew a head on the ground beneath. As part of the prince's disguise had been a thick beard, the men did not recognize the dead man as the Rajah's brother, but they wrapped the head in a cloth and buried the body as their commander bade them. When this was ended, the officer took the cloth and rode off in the direction of the palace. Meanwhile, the Rajah came home from his council, and to his great surprise found neither head nor brother awaiting him. As time passed on, he became uneasy, and thought that he had better go himself and see what the matter was. So ordering his horse, he rode off alone. It happened that, just as the Rajah came near to the temple where Ram Singh still sat, the young treasurer, hearing the sound of a horse's hooves, looked over his shoulder and saw that the rider was the Rajah himself. Feeling much ashamed of himself for having forgotten his errand, he jumped up and hurried out to meet his master, who reined up his horse and seemed very surprised, as indeed he was, to see him. At that moment there arrived the officer of the guard carrying his parcel. He saluted the Rajah gravely and, dismounting, laid the bundle in the road and began to undo the wrappings, whilst the Rajah watched him with wonder and interest. When the last string was undone, and the head of his brother was displayed to his view, the Rajah sprang from his horse and caught the soldier by the arm. As soon as he could speak, He questioned the man as to what had occurred, and little by little a dark suspicion darted through him. Then, briefly telling the soldier that he had done well, the Raja drew Ram Singh to one side, and in a few minutes learned from him how, in attending to the Guru's counsel, he had delayed to do the king's message. In the end, the Raja found from some papers the proofs of his dead brother's treachery, and Ram Singh established his innocence and integrity. He continued to serve the Raja for many years with unswerving fidelity, and married a maiden of his own rank in life, with whom he lived happily, dying at last honored and loved by all men. Sons were born to him, and in time to them also he taught the 5 wise sayings of the old Guru. Once upon a time there lived in Egypt a king who lost his sight from a bad illness. Of course he was very unhappy, and became more so as months passed, and all the best doctors in the land were unable to cure him. The poor man grew so thin from misery that everyone thought he was going to die, and the prince, his only son, thought so too. Great was therefore the rejoicing through Egypt when a traveler arrived in a boat down the river Nile, and after questioning the people as to the reason of their downcast looks, declared that he was court physician to the king of a far country, and would, if allowed, examine the eyes of the blind man. He was at once admitted into the royal presence, and after a few minutes of careful study announced that the case, though very serious, was not quite hopeless. "Somewhere in the great sea," he said, "there exists a golden-headed fish. If you can manage to catch this creature, bring it to me, and I will prepare an ointment from its blood which will restore your sight. For 100 days I will wait here, but if at the end of that time the fish should still be uncaught, I must return to my own master." The next morning the young prince set forth in quest of the fish, taking with him 100 men, each man carrying a net. Quite a little fleet of boats was awaiting them, and in these they sailed to the middle of the great sea. During 3 months they labored diligently from sunrise to sunset, but though they caught large multitudes of fishes, not one of them had a golden head. "It is quite useless now," said the prince on the very last night. "Even if we find it this evening, the 100 days will be over in an hour, and long before we could reach the Egyptian capital the doctor will be on his way home. Still, I will go out again and cast the net once more myself." And so he did, and at the very moment that the 100 days were up, he drew in the net with the golden-headed fish entangled in its meshes. "Success has come, but, as happens often, it is too late," murmured the young man who had studied in the schools of philosophy. "But, all the same, put the fish in that vessel full of water, and we will take it back to show my father that we have done what we could." But when he drew near the fish, it looked up at him with such piteous eyes that he could not make up his mind to condemn it to death. For he knew well that, though the doctors of his own country were ignorant of the secret of the ointment, they would do all in their power to extract something from the fish's blood. So he picked up the prize of so much labor, and threw it back into the sea. and then began his journey back to the palace. When at last he reached it, he found the king in a high fever, caused by his disappointment, and he refused to believe the story told him by his son. "Your head shall pay for it! Your head shall pay for it!" cried he, and bade the courtiers instantly summon the executioner to the palace. But of course somebody ran at once to the queen and told her of the king's order, and she put common clothes on the prince, and filled his pockets with gold, and hurried him on board a ship which was sailing that night for a distant island. "Your father will repent some day, and then he will be thankful to know you are alive," said she. "But one last counsel will I give you, and that is, take no man into your service who desires to be paid every month." The young prince thought this advice rather odd. If the servant had to be paid anyhow, he did not understand what difference it could make whether it was by the year or by the month. However, he had many times proved that his mother was wiser than he, so he promised obedience. After a voyage of several weeks, he arrived at the island of which his mother had spoken. It was full of hills and woods and flowers, and beautiful white houses stood everywhere in gardens. "What a charming spot to live in," thought the prince, and he lost no time in buying one of the prettiest of the dwellings. Then servants came pressing to offer their services, but as they all declared that they must have payment at the end of every month, the young man, who remembered his mother's words, declined to have anything to say to them. At length one morning, an Arab appeared and begged that the prince would engage him. "And what wages do you ask?" inquired the prince, when he had questioned the newcomer and found him suitable. "I do not want money," answered the Arab. "At the end of a year you can see what my services are worth to you, and can pay me in any way you like." And the young man was pleased, and took the Arab for his servant. Now, although no one would have guessed it from the look of the side of the island where the prince had landed, the other part was a complete desert, owing to the ravages of a horrible monster which came up from the sea and devoured all the corn and cattle. The governor had sent bands of soldiers to lie in wait for the creature in order to kill it, but somehow no one ever happened to be awake at the moment that the ravages were committed. It was in vain that the sleepy soldiers were always punished severely. The same thing invariably occurred next time, and at last heralds were sent throughout the island to offer a great reward to the man who could slay the monster. As soon as the Arab heard the news, he went straight to the governor's palace. "If my master can succeed in killing the monster, what reward will you give him?" asked he. "My daughter, and anything besides that he chooses," answered the governor. But the Arab shook his head. "Give him your daughter and keep your wealth," said he, "but henceforward let her share in your gains, whatever they are." "It is well," replied the governor, and ordered a deed to be prepared which was signed by both of them. That night the Arab stole down to the shore to watch, But before he set out, he rubbed himself all over with some oil, which made his skin smart so badly that there was no chance of his going to sleep as the soldiers had done. Then he hid himself behind a large rock and waited. By and by, a swell seemed to rise on the water, and a few minutes later a hideous monster, part bird, part beast, and part serpent, stepped noiselessly onto the rocks. It walked stealthily up towards the fields, but the Arab was ready for it, and as it passed, plunged his dagger into the soft part behind the ear. The creature staggered and gave a loud cry, and then rolled over dead, with its feet in the sea. The Arab watched for a little while, in order to make sure that there was no life left in his enemy, but as the huge body remained quite still, he quitted his hiding place and cut off the ears of his foe. These he carried to his master, bidding him show them to the governor, and declare that he himself and no other had killed the monster. "But it was you, and not I, who slew him," objected the prince. "Never mind. Do as I bid you." "I have a reason for it," answered the Arab. And though the young man did not like taking credit for what he had never done, at length he gave in. The governor was so delighted at the news that he begged the prince to take his daughter to wife that very day. But the prince refused, saying that all he desired was a ship which would carry him to see the world. Of course this was granted him at once, and when he and his faithful Arab embarked, they found, heaped up in the vessel, stores of diamonds and precious stones, which the grateful governor had secretly placed there. So they sailed, and they sailed, and they sailed, and at length they reached the shores of a great kingdom. Leaving the prince on board, the Arab went into the town to find out what sort of a place it was. After some hours he returned, saying that he heard that the king's daughter was the most beautiful princess in the world, and that the prince would do well to ask for her hand. Nothing loath, the prince listened to this advice, and taking some of the finest necklaces in his hand, he mounted a splendid horse which the Arab had bought for him, and rode up to the palace, closely followed by his faithful attendant. The strange king happened to be in a good humor, and they were readily admitted to his presence. Laying down his offerings on the steps of the throne, he prayed the king to grant him his daughter in marriage. The monarch listened to him in silence, but answered after a pause, "Young man, I will give you my daughter to wife, if that is your wish. But first I must tell you that she has already gone through the marriage ceremony with 190 young men, and not one of them lived for 12 hours after. So think, while there is yet time." The prince did think, and was so frightened that he very nearly went back to his ship without any more words. But just as he was about to withdraw his proposal, the Arab whispered, "Fear nothing, but take her. The luck must change some time," he said at last. "And who would not risk his head for the hand of such a peerless princess?" "As you will," replied the king. "Then I will give orders that the marriage shall be celebrated tonight." And so it was done. And after the ceremony, the bride and bridegroom retired to their own apartments to sup by themselves, for such was the custom of the country. The moon shone bright, and the prince walked to the window to look out upon the river and upon the distant hills, when his gaze suddenly fell on a silken shroud neatly laid out on a couch, with his name embroidered in gold thread across the front, for this also was the pleasure of the king. Horrified at the spectacle, he turned his head away, and this time his glance rested on a group of men digging busily beneath the window. It was a strange hour for anyone to be at work, and what was the hole for? It was a curious shape, so long and narrow, almost like— ah, yes, that was what it was. It was his grave that they were digging. The shock of the discovery rendered him speechless, yet he stood fascinated and unable to move. At this moment, a small black snake darted from the mouth of the princess, who was seated at the table, and wriggled quickly towards him. But the Arab was watching for something of the sort to happen, and seizing the serpent with some pincers that he held in one hand, he cut off its head with a sharp dagger. The king could hardly believe his eyes when, early the next morning, his new son-in-law craved an audience of his majesty. "What, you?" he cried, as the young man entered. "Yes, I. Why not?" asked the bridegroom, who thought it best to pretend not to know anything that had occurred. "You remember I told you that the luck must turn at last, and so it has. But I came to ask whether you would be so kind as to bid the gardeners fill up a great hole right underneath my window, which spoils the view." "Oh, certainly, yes, of course it shall be done," stammered the king. "Is there anything else?" "No, nothing, thank you," replied the prince, as he bowed and withdrew. Now, from the moment that the Arab cut off the snake's head, the spell, or whatever it was, seemed to have been taken off the princess, and she lived very happily with her husband. The days passed swiftly in hunting in the forests, or sailing on the broad river that flowed past the palace, and when night fell she would sing to her harp, or the prince would tell her tales of his own country. One evening a man in a strange garb, with a face burnt brown by the sun, arrived at court. He asked to see the bridegroom, and falling on his face announced that he was a messenger sent by the Queen of Egypt, proclaiming him king in succession to his father who was dead. "Her Majesty begs you will set out without delay, and your bride also, as the affairs of the kingdom are somewhat in disorder," ended the messenger. Then the young man hastened to seek an audience of his father-in-law, who was delighted to find that his daughter's husband was not merely the governor of a province, as he had supposed, but the king of a powerful country. He at once ordered a splendid ship to be made ready, and in a week's time rode down to the harbor to bid farewell to the young couple. In spite of her grief for the dead king, the queen was overjoyed to welcome her son home, and commanded the palace to be hung with splendid stuffs to do honor to the bride. The people expected great things from their new sovereign, for they had suffered much from the harsh rule of the old one, and crowds presented themselves every morning with petitions in their hands, which they hoped to persuade the king to grant. Truly, he had enough to keep him busy, but he was very happy for all that. till one night the Arab came to him and begged permission to return to his own land. Filled with dismay, the young man said, "Leave me. Do you really wish to leave me?" Sadly, the Arab bowed his head. "No, my master. Never could I wish to leave you, but I have received a summons and I dare not disobey it." The king was silent, trying to choke down the grief he felt at the thought of losing his faithful servant. "Well, I must not try to keep you," he faltered out at last. "That would be a poor return for all that you have done for me. Everything I have is yours. Take what you will, for without you I should long ago have been dead. And without you I should long ago have been dead," answered the Arab. "I am the golden-headed fish." And now, as we come to the end of this session, if you're still awake, I would like you to feel the calm you've created within yourself. You've given your mind and body such a beautiful gift, a moment to simply be. Let that sense of peace stay with you as you move through the rest of your night. If you'd like, you can stay here a little longer.